Sometimes the universe has a way of placing exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Marcus Rivera had no way of knowing that fixing a broken pipe in Eleanor Whitmore's crumbling Victorian mansion would change his life forever. The single father of two had been scraping by on odd jobs for months, watching his savings dwindle while his children grew out of their clothes. When the elderly woman offered him steady work, restoring her decaying estate, Marcus thought his prayers had finally been answered. He had no idea that the fragile, soft-spoken widow who paid him in cash and homemade sandwiches was sitting on a fortune worth $500 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn silence at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past 18 months. Marcus Rivera's weathered hand slammed down on the snooze button, his body aching from yesterday's labor. Just 10 more minutes before facing another day of uncertainty, another day of wondering if there would be enough work to keep his small family afloat. The cramped apartment felt even smaller in the gray morning light seeping through the thin curtains. 3 bedrooms that barely qualified as closets, 1 bathroom with a sink that dripped constantly, and a kitchen where Marcus had to turn sideways to reach the refrigerator. The rent was $1,200 a month, which might as well have been $12,000 on his unpredictable income. But it was safe, relatively clean, and most importantly, it kept his children housed. 8-year-old Sofia's door stood slightly open, revealing the little girl curled up under a patchwork quilt his mother had made years ago. Her dark curls spread across the pillow, and even in sleep she clutched the worn stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since her mother left 2 years ago. On the nightstand sat Sofia's homework from the previous evening, math problems completed in her careful, precise handwriting. The girl had inherited her father's determination and her grandmother's sharp mind. 12-year-old Diego's room was organized with military precision, clothes folded neatly, books arranged by height, school supplies lined up like soldiers. The boy had taken on the role of family protector after his mother's abandonment, becoming serious and responsible beyond his years. A basketball sat in the corner, deflated because Marcus couldn't afford to replace the valve that had broken months ago. Marcus padded to the kitchen, his bare feet silent on the worn linoleum that curled at the edges near the stove. Coffee first, then a quick shower, then loading his battered pickup truck with the tools that represented his livelihood. Today's job was at the Whitmore estate, a Victorian mansion on Magnolia Hill that had been slowly crumbling for decades. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the small space with the rich aroma that had become Marcus's morning ritual. Through the kitchen window, he could see the wealthy part of town where massive houses sat behind iron gates and manicured lawns. Somewhere up there, past the country club and the private school his children would never attend, stood the house where he hoped to find steady work. Eleanor Whitmore had called 3 days ago, her voice thin and uncertain over the phone. She needed someone reliable, she'd said, someone who could fix the things that kept breaking in her old house. The previous handyman had disappeared without explanation, leaving half-finished projects and a list of problems that seemed to grow longer each day. Marcus had agreed to come by for an estimate, expecting another small job that would barely cover groceries. What he found instead was a mansion that should have been condemned. The Victorian structure rose 3 stories above an overgrown garden, its paint peeling in long strips that hung like dead skin. Shutters dangled at odd angles, the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of missing support beams, and several windows were covered with plywood or plastic sheeting. It was the kind of place children dared each other to approach on Halloween. Eleanor Whitmore herself had been almost as shocking as her house. Tiny and bird-like, probably in her 80s, she moved through the mansion's cavernous rooms with the careful steps of someone navigating familiar obstacles in near darkness. Her clothes were clean, but decades out of style, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun secured with what appeared to be a pencil. When she smiled, which she did often, her face transformed from frail to radiant. "I know it doesn't look like much," she'd said during his initial walkthrough, her voice carrying the refined accent of old money. "But this house has good bones, Mr. Rivera. Sometimes, that's all you need to build something beautiful." Marcus had spent 2 hours cataloging the mansion's problems. The plumbing system dated back to the 1920s and leaked in at least 6 places. The electrical wiring was a fire hazard that belonged in a museum. The roof leaked during every rainstorm, creating water damage that had spread throughout the upper floors. The heating system had given up completely, leaving Eleanor to warm herself with space heaters that probably violated every safety code in the city. Any reasonable contractor would have recommended demolition. The cost of bringing the mansion up to modern standards would exceed its value, even in the prestigious Magnolia Hill neighborhood. But Eleanor Whitmore had looked at Marcus with eyes that held desperate hope, and he'd found himself agreeing to tackle the restoration one problem at a time. "I can't pay much," she'd warned him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for an envelope thick with cash. "But I can offer you steady work, and I promise you'll never leave here hungry." The money had been more than fair for the first week's work, and Eleanor had indeed kept her promise about the food. Each day brought homemade meals that reminded Marcus of his childhood, thick sandwiches on fresh bread, hearty soups that filled the mansion's kitchen with warmth, desserts that made Sofia and Diego beg to visit the job site. Eleanor Whitmore might live in a crumbling house, but she cooked like someone who understood that food was love made tangible. This morning, Marcus loaded his truck with the tools he'd need to tackle the mansion's ancient boiler system. The heating unit had finally given up completely during the previous night's cold snap, and Eleanor had called in a panic, her voice shaking with more than just the chill. Winter was settling over the city, and without heat, the old woman could freeze in her cavernous home. The drive to Magnolia Hill took 20 minutes through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. Modest apartments gave way to suburban houses, which yielded to sprawling estates hidden behind stone walls and electronic gates. Marcus had grown up in this city, but he'd never had reason to venture into the wealthy enclave where Eleanor's mansion stood like a Gothic reminder of better days. The Whitmore estate occupied nearly 3 acres at the end of a tree-lined street where every other house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfectly maintained lawns, luxury cars in circular driveways, windows that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Eleanor's property stood out like a broken tooth in a perfect smile. Marcus parked his truck in the circular drive, its exhaust system coughing and smoking in protest. The contrast between his battered vehicle and the mansion's faded grandeur struck him every morning. Both had seen better days, both were struggling to maintain dignity despite obvious decay. Perhaps that's why he felt such kinship with the old house and its owner. Eleanor met him at the front door, wrapped in at least 3 layers of sweaters and still shivering. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air that filled the mansion's entrance hall. The grand staircase that curved toward the upper floors looked like something from a movie, but its carved banister was loose in several places. And preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Persian runner that covered the steps had worn through to bare wood. "Oh, Mr. Rivera, thank goodness you're here," Eleanor said, her relief evident in every word. "The temperature dropped to 40 degrees inside last night. I'm afraid this old house wasn't built for modern winters." Marcus followed her through rooms that should have been featured in architectural magazines. 12-foot ceilings, crown molding that had been hand-carved by master craftsmen. Hardwood floors that would be priceless if they weren't water-damaged and warped. Original oil paintings hung on walls where the wallpaper peeled in elegant strips. Crystal chandeliers dangled from chains that hadn't been properly maintained in decades. The basement where the boiler lived was a testament to 7 decades of deferred maintenance. Pipes snaked across the ceiling in configurations that defied logic, their joints weeping rust-colored tears onto the concrete floor. The electrical panel looked like it had been installed during the Eisenhower administration, and at the center of it all squatted the boiler, a cast-iron monster the size of a small car that had given up its ghost sometime during the night. Marcus spent an hour diagnosing the problem, tracing pipes and checking connections while Eleanor hovered nearby, offering nervous commentary and cups of coffee that somehow stayed hot despite the frigid air. The boiler's main heat exchanger had cracked, probably from decades of thermal stress and neglect. Repairing it would require parts that might not even exist anymore, assuming the rest of the system could handle the stress. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said finally, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "I'm afraid this boiler is beyond repair. The heat exchanger is cracked. The circulation pump is seized, and the control system stopped working properly years ago. You're going to need a complete replacement." Eleanor's face fell, her shoulders sagging under the weight of another expensive problem. "How much would that cost, Mr. Rivera?" Marcus did quick calculations in his head. A new heating system for a house this size would run at least $20,000, probably more given the mansion's unusual layout and the custom work required to integrate modern equipment with century-old infrastructure. It was the kind of expense that would bankrupt most people, especially someone living on a fixed income in a deteriorating house. "It's not cheap," Marcus said gently, "but I might be able to find some temporary solutions while we work out the details. Maybe some electric heaters for the rooms you use most, and I could try to get the kitchen radiator working again." Eleanor nodded, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. She was calculating expenses the same way he did every month, trying to figure out how to stretch limited resources across unlimited needs. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were discussing heating bills in a mansion that probably cost more to heat than his apartment cost to rent. They spent the rest of the morning rigging temporary heating solutions. Marcus installed electric baseboard heaters in Eleanor's bedroom and the kitchen, ran extension cords through the mansion's labyrinthine hallways, and managed to coax life back into one ancient radiator. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would keep the old woman from freezing while they figured out the larger problem. Eleanor insisted on making lunch, disappearing into the kitchen while Marcus continued working. The mansion's kitchen was enormous, designed for a staff of servants that hadn't existed for decades. Commercial-grade appliances from the 1950s sat alongside modern conveniences that Eleanor had added over the years. A massive Viking range stood next to a microwave that looked like it had survived the Reagan administration. The lunch Eleanor prepared was spectacular. Homemade chicken soup with vegetables from what Marcus was learning had once been an extensive garden, fresh bread that she'd apparently baked that morning despite the cold, and apple pie that would have won ribbons at county fairs. They ate at a kitchen table that could have seated 12, the only warm room in the entire mansion. "You know, Mr. Rivera," Eleanor said as they shared the meal, "I've been living in this house for 53 years, and I don't think I've ever appreciated how lucky I am to have it, even when it's falling apart around me." Marcus looked around the kitchen, taking in details he'd been too busy to notice before. The cabinets were solid oak, built by craftsmen who took pride in their work. The countertops were genuine marble, probably installed when the mansion was built. Even the old appliances were built to last, their chrome surfaces still gleaming despite decades of use. "It's a beautiful house, Mrs. Whitmore. Someone put a lot of love into building it." Eleanor's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing through the present decay to some earlier version of the mansion. "My husband's grandfather built this house in 1895. Every nail, every board, every piece of glass was chosen specifically for this location. The architect came from New York, the marble from Vermont, the hardwood from Oregon. Nothing was too good for the Whitmore family." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table's surface. "Of course, that was back when the family had money to spare. These days, I'm afraid I'm the last of the Whitmores, and I'm not much good at maintaining a house this size." Marcus had wondered about Eleanor's financial situation since his first day at the mansion. The house itself suggested old money, but the condition suggested current poverty. Eleanor dressed like someone who shopped at thrift stores, drove a car that should have been retired years ago, and seemed to stretch every dollar. Yet she always had cash to pay him, and her meals suggested someone who still had access to quality ingredients. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you don't mind me asking, have you thought about downsizing? A house this size must be expensive to maintain, especially with all the repairs it needs." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that had been weighing on her for years. "Mr. Rivera, I've lived in this house since I was 27 years old. I got married in the front parlor, raised my children in the upstairs bedrooms, cared for my husband through his final illness in the master suite. Every room holds memories that I'm not ready to let go of." She stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the overgrown garden where geometric shapes hinted at formal landscaping that had once been the envy of the neighborhood. "But you're right, of course. This house is too big for one old woman, too expensive to maintain properly, too full of problems for someone my age to handle. I know I should sell it and move into one of those senior living communities." Marcus joined her at the window, following her gaze across the garden to the carriage house that sat at the property's rear boundary. The smaller building looked to be in even worse condition than the mansion, its roof partially collapsed and its walls stained with decades of weather damage. "The thing is," Eleanor continued, "I made a promise to my husband before he died. I told him I'd take care of this place, preserve the family legacy, make sure the Whitmore name meant something long after we were gone. Selling the house feels like breaking that promise." Marcus understood promises made to dying spouses. His own wife hadn't died, but her departure had been preceded by weeks of arguments about money, responsibility, and the future they'd planned together. Sometimes keeping promises to people who were gone was easier than facing the reality of life without them. "What if there were a way to preserve the legacy without keeping the house?" Marcus asked gently. "Historic preservation societies, architectural foundations, maybe even the city's landmarks commission. A house this beautiful shouldn't just decay." Eleanor turned from the window with a sad smile. "Mr. Rivera, you're very kind to suggest it, but historic preservation requires money that I simply don't have. The city has been after me for years to bring the house up to code. The property taxes increase every year, and the utilities alone cost more than some people's rent. I'm afraid the Whitmore legacy is going to end with me and this slowly crumbling house." The afternoon was spent working on the mansion's electrical problems. Half the outlets in the house didn't work, the other half were fire hazards that sparked when plugs were inserted. Marcus traced wiring through walls that hadn't been opened since the Truman administration, finding junction boxes that had been installed by electricians who were probably dead and buried. The work was tedious, requiring patience and creativity to make modern solutions work with antique infrastructure. Eleanor followed him from room to room, sharing stories about the mansion's history and her life within its walls. The front parlor, where she'd been married, featured a fireplace with a mantel carved from a single piece of oak. The dining room had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 40 people back when the Whitmore family gathered from across the country. The library contained first-edition books collected over 3 generations, their leather bindings cracked, but their contents still readable. Each room revealed new evidence of the mansion's former grandeur and current neglect. Hand-painted wallpaper that would be priceless if it weren't peeling off the walls. Crystal chandeliers that hadn't been cleaned in decades, their beauty obscured by dust and time. Hardwood floors that had been crafted by artists but were now warped and stained from years of leaks and neglect. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself increasingly invested in the mansion's restoration. This wasn't just another job anymore. Eleanor's stories had brought the house to life, transforming it from a collection of problems into a repository of history and memory. Every repair felt like an act of preservation. Every improvement a step toward honoring the promises Eleanor had made to her husband. The electrical work led Marcus to areas of the house he hadn't explored yet. A servant's staircase that connected all 3 floors, its narrow steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Storage rooms filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, pieces that probably belonged in museums. And everywhere, evidence of lives fully lived within these walls. Family photographs, children's drawings preserved in frames, awards and certificates that spoke of accomplishments and community involvement. In the mansion's 3rd-floor attic, Marcus discovered something that stopped him in his tracks. A cedar chest filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be business records dating back decades. The papers were organized with the same attention to detail that Eleanor brought to her cooking, each category carefully labeled and preserved in protective folders. At the top of the chest sat a photograph that made Marcus's breath catch. It showed Eleanor as a young woman, probably in her 30s, standing beside a man in a business suit in front of what appeared to be an oil derrick. They were both smiling, their clothes and the equipment suggesting the photograph had been taken sometime in the 1960s. Behind them, other oil derricks stretched to the horizon, and workers in hard hats celebrated what appeared to be a successful drilling operation. Marcus studied the photograph more carefully, noting the expensive cars in the background and the quality of Eleanor's clothing. This wasn't a casual tourist photo. This was a picture of people who belonged in the oil business, people who had reason to celebrate a successful well. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus called down through the house's maze of hallways, "could you come up to the attic for a moment?" Eleanor's footsteps on the wooden stairs were slow and careful, but her breathing wasn't labored when she reached the third floor. For someone her age living in a house without proper heating, she maintained impressive physical condition. "Oh my," she said when she saw the cedar chest with its contents partially exposed. "I haven't been up here in years. I'd forgotten about some of these old things." Marcus held up the photograph, watching Eleanor's face carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, is this you in this picture?" Eleanor took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes growing distant as she studied the image. For a moment, she looked exactly like the young woman in the picture, confident, prosperous, surrounded by success. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was taken in Texas, 1964. Henry and I had just brought in our first successful well. We thought we were going to conquer the world." Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Eleanor's refined accent, her knowledge of quality ingredients and fine cooking, her ability to pay him in cash despite living in a deteriorating house. The Whitmores hadn't just been wealthy in the past, they'd been in the oil business. "Mrs. Whitmore, forgive me for asking, but what happened to the oil business? Did you and your husband sell your interests?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions made decades ago and their long-term consequences. "Mr. Rivera, that's a complicated story, and I'm afraid it's getting late. Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time." But Marcus had seen something in her expression, a flicker of pain that suggested the story behind the photograph involved more than simple business decisions. Eleanor Whitmore was hiding something, and that something might explain why someone who had once celebrated successful oil wells was now living in a mansion that was slowly crumbling around her. As they climbed down from the attic, Marcus's mind raced with questions. The cedar chest had contained more than just photographs. He'd glimpsed legal documents, business correspondence, and what appeared to be financial records. If Eleanor and her husband had been successful in the oil business, what had happened to their wealth? The afternoon's work continued with installing additional electrical outlets in Eleanor's bedroom and the kitchen. The old woman worked alongside him, handing him tools and offering commentary that revealed surprising knowledge about electrical systems and construction techniques. This wasn't someone who had lived her entire life as a pampered housewife. Eleanor Whitmore understood how buildings worked. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said as he secured a new outlet box to a wall stud, "you seem to know quite a bit about construction. Did you and your husband work on houses together?" Eleanor laughed, the sound transforming her from frail, elderly woman to someone much younger and more energetic. "Mr. Rivera, when you're in the oil business, you learn about all kinds of construction. Drilling platforms, refinery buildings, pipeline installations. Henry used to joke that I knew more about structural engineering than most men with degrees." She paused, her expression growing wistful. "Of course, that was a long time ago. These days, I'm afraid my expertise is limited to trying to keep this old house from falling down around my ears." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the mansion's tall windows, Marcus gathered his tools and prepared to leave. Eleanor walked him to the front door, as had become their daily ritual. She pressed an envelope of cash into his hand, the payment generous for the day's work. "Mr. Rivera, I want to thank you for everything you're doing. I know this house must seem like a hopeless project, but having you here, seeing the problems getting fixed one at a time, it gives me hope that maybe Henry's dream isn't completely lost." Marcus looked back at the mansion's grand entrance hall with its soaring ceiling and crystal chandelier that hadn't worked in years. Tomorrow he would return to continue the endless process of repairs and restoration. But tonight, he would go home to his children with questions about Eleanor Whitmore that seemed to grow more complex each day. The drive home took him back through the increasingly modest neighborhoods, past the suburban houses and apartment complexes where people like him struggled to make ends meet. But his mind remained fixed on the photograph from the attic and Eleanor's cryptic comments about the oil business. Diego and Sofia were waiting for him when he arrived at their apartment, homework spread across the kitchen table, and the smell of frozen pizza filling the small space. Mrs. Gonzalez from next door had watched them after school, as she did most days when Marcus's work ran late. The elderly woman refused payment for her help, insisting that neighbors looked out for each other. "Dad, how's the ghost house?" Sofia asked, looking up from a math worksheet that showed impressive progress for a second grader. "It's not a ghost house, Mija." It's just old and needs a lot of work. Diego was more perceptive, studying his father's expression with the intensity he brought to everything. "Dad, you look like you're thinking about something important. Did something happen at work today?" Marcus sat down at the table with his children, accepting a slice of pizza that tasted like cardboard compared to Eleanor's homemade meals. How could he explain that he discovered something about his employer that didn't make sense, that the old woman living in the crumbling mansion might not be as poor as she appeared? "I found some old photographs in the house today," he said finally. "Pictures of Mrs. Whitmore when she was younger. She and her husband used to be in business together." "What kind of business?" Diego asked, his curiosity evident. "Oil drilling." They had wells in Texas back in the 1960s. Sofia looked up from her homework with the intensity she brought to all mysteries. If they had oil wells, why does she live in a broken house? It was exactly the question Marcus had been asking himself. If Eleanor and her husband had been successful in the oil business, what had happened to their money? Why was she living like someone on a fixed income while sitting in a mansion that should have been worth millions, even in its current condition? That night, after Diego and Sofia were asleep, Marcus sat at his laptop researching oil drilling operations in Texas during the 1960s. What he found was a complex world of boom and bust cycles, successful wells and dry holes, fortunes made and lost on geological gambles. But he also found something else. References to Whitmore Energy Corporation, a family-owned oil company that had operated throughout Texas and Louisiana for over 2 decades. The company had been involved in several major discoveries, including some wells that had produced for years. According to the records he could find online, Whitmore Energy had been sold in the late 1980s for an undisclosed amount to a larger petroleum corporation. Marcus stared at his laptop screen, trying to understand what he was seeing. If Eleanor's family company had been successful enough to attract acquisition by a major corporation, the sale should have left her financially secure for life. So why was she living in a deteriorating mansion, worrying about heating bills and paying handymen with cash from envelopes? The questions followed him into restless sleep, where he dreamed of oil derricks rising from Eleanor's overgrown garden and cedar chests filled with secrets that might explain everything or nothing at all. Tomorrow he would return to the mansion and continue the endless process of repairs, but now he would be looking for more than just broken pipes and faulty wiring. He would be looking for answers to questions that Eleanor Whitmore seemed determined not to answer. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if those answers might change everything for his own struggling family. The Whitmore mansion held its secrets close, revealing them only to those patient enough to look beyond the surface decay to the history hidden within its walls. Marcus Rivera was about to discover that sometimes the most valuable treasures are concealed in the most unexpected places, waiting for exactly the right person to find them at exactly the right time. But tonight, as winter wind rattled the windows of his small apartment and his children slept peacefully in their beds, Marcus had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Eleanor Whitmore's story was far from over, and the handyman who had agreed to fix her broken house was about to become part of a legacy that would transform them both forever. The morning newspaper lay folded beside Eleanor's coffee cup when Marcus arrived at the mansion, its headline barely visible but somehow drawing his attention. Oil giant acquires independent Texas operator for undisclosed sum. The article was dated March 15, 1987, nearly 4 decades old, but Eleanor had saved it with the same careful preservation she applied to everything else in her life. Marcus discovered the newspaper while replacing a section of rotted floorboard in the mansion's breakfast nook. Eleanor had gone to the market, leaving him alone with his tools and growing curiosity about the woman who paid him in cash but lived like someone counting every penny. The newspaper had been tucked beneath a loose board, probably forgotten for years until his repairs revealed its hiding place. The article mentioned Whitmore Energy Corporation specifically, describing it as a family-owned operation that had successfully developed several producing wells throughout East Texas. The acquisition price wasn't disclosed, but industry analysts quoted in the piece suggested the deal was worth somewhere between $50 and $200 million, depending on the company's proven reserves and future drilling rights. Marcus stared at the yellowed newsprint, trying to reconcile the information with the woman who had served him coffee from a chipped mug that morning. Eleanor Whitmore had been party to a business deal that should have set her up for multiple lifetimes of luxury. Yet she was living in a house where half the electrical outlets didn't work and the heating system belonged in a museum. The sound of Eleanor's car in the driveway sent Marcus scrambling to replace the floorboard and hide the newspaper. Something told him that Eleanor's financial history wasn't a topic she wanted to discuss, at least not yet. But the questions multiplied with each passing hour. What had happened to the money from the sale? Why was someone who should be worth millions living like someone on Social Security? Eleanor returned with groceries that suggested someone shopping carefully within a limited budget. Generic brands, items on sale, the kind of careful purchasing Marcus recognized from his own trips to the store. She prepared lunch with the same attention to quality that characterized all her cooking, but Marcus noticed she used ingredients sparingly, stretching everything to last as long as possible. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said as they shared sandwiches made from bread she'd baked herself, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you lived in this house your entire married life?" Eleanor's expression grew wistful, her eyes focusing on something beyond the kitchen window. "Not quite. Henry and I lived in Texas for the first 15 years of our marriage. We had a small house outside Houston. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. We moved here in 1971 when Henry's father became ill and needed someone to manage the family properties." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table surface. The plan was to stay just long enough to get Mr. Whitmore Sr.'s affairs in order, then return to Texas and the oil business. But plans have a way of changing when life intervenes. Marcus waited for her to continue, sensing there was more to the story. Eleanor seemed to be weighing how much to reveal, her expression shifting between openness and caution. "Henry's father passed away 6 months after we arrived," she continued finally. "By then, we'd discovered that the family finances weren't as stable as they'd appeared. The old man had been borrowing against the house and properties to cover medical expenses and failed investments. We found ourselves responsible for debts we hadn't known existed." The picture was becoming clearer, but it still didn't explain everything. If the Whitmores had sold their oil company for tens of millions of dollars, why couldn't they have paid off the family debts and restored the mansion to its former glory? "Mrs. Whitmore, forgive me for being personal, but when you and your husband sold Whitmore Energy, wasn't that enough to solve the financial problems?" Eleanor's sandwich remained untouched on her plate as she considered the question. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that had shaped the rest of her life. "Mr. Rivera, the oil business is more complicated than most people realize. Success on paper doesn't always translate to cash in hand. Henry and I learned that lesson the hard way." She stood and walked to a kitchen drawer, removing a manila folder thick with documents. Inside were contracts, legal papers, and correspondence that painted a complex picture of business deals gone wrong and partnerships that had soured over time. Whitmore Energy was successful, you're right about that. But success in the oil business often means reinvesting everything back into new wells, new equipment, new exploration. Henry and I were asset-rich but cash-poor for most of our marriage. When we finally sold the company, much of the proceeds went to partners, investors, and creditors we'd accumulated over the years. Marcus studied the documents Eleanor shared, trying to understand the financial maze that had trapped two people who should have been wealthy. Partnership agreements that heavily favored outside investors. Drilling contracts that tied up capital for years at a time. Bank loans secured against future production that might or might not materialize. The final blow came in 1989, Eleanor continued, her voice growing quiet. Henry had a stroke just 2 years after we sold the company. The medical bills, the rehabilitation costs, the modifications we needed to make to this house so he could live here safely. It consumed what was left of our savings. Eleanor showed Marcus photographs from that period. Henry Whitmore confined to a wheelchair, but still smiling as Eleanor pushed him through the mansion's garden. The couple celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary in the front parlor, surrounded by friends who had stood by them through prosperity and struggle alike. Henry lived for 12 more years after the stroke, Eleanor said, her eyes bright with tears that didn't fall. 12 wonderful years when we learned that love matters more than money, that happiness doesn't require wealth. But those years were expensive, Mr. Rivera. By the time Henry passed away in 2001, I had mortgaged this house twice and spent every penny we'd saved. The story explained much about Eleanor's current situation, but it also raised new questions. Marcus had been working on the mansion for 2 weeks, and Eleanor had paid him promptly each day. If she was truly broke, where was the money coming from? "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't mean to pry, but how are you managing to pay for the work on the house? The repairs, the materials, my labor costs. If your savings are gone." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face from sad to mysterious. "Mr. Rivera, I may have spent the oil money, but I'm not completely destitute. An old woman learns to be resourceful when circumstances require it." That afternoon's work took Marcus deeper into the mansion's basement, where he was installing new electrical circuits to replace the ancient wiring that sparked and failed with increasing frequency. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, utility spaces, and areas that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. Eleanor had given him free rein to explore, trusting him to navigate the mansion's hidden spaces without supervision. In a storage room behind the main furnace, Marcus discovered something that made him question everything he thought he understood about Eleanor's financial situation. A modern safe, clearly expensive and recently installed, sat incongruously among the basement's vintage, equipment, and forgotten furniture. The safe was large enough to hold important documents, valuable items, or significant amounts of cash. Marcus stared at the safe, his mind racing with possibilities. Eleanor had claimed to be broke, but people who were truly destitute didn't install expensive security equipment in their basements. The safe suggested that Eleanor Whitmore was hiding something valuable, something that might explain how she could afford to pay for extensive home repairs while claiming to have no money. The electrical work continued through the afternoon, but Marcus found himself distracted by the mystery of the safe and the growing inconsistencies in Eleanor's story. She lived like someone on a tight budget, but she paid generously and without hesitation. She claimed to have spent all her money on medical bills, but she had installed expensive security equipment. She worried about heating costs, but she cooked with ingredients that suggested access to quality grocers. When Eleanor called him upstairs for their afternoon coffee break, Marcus found her sitting in the front parlor, surrounded by photo albums and loose photographs. She was organizing pictures that spanned decades, creating neat piles sorted by year and occasion. "Mr. Rivera, I hope you don't mind the mess," Eleanor said, gesturing to the photographs scattered across every available surface. "I've been meaning to organize these for years, but somehow I never found the time." Growing old makes you realize that memories are more important than money. Marcus sat in an antique chair that had probably cost more than his truck, accepting a cup of coffee that was perfectly brewed, despite being served in a chipped mug. Eleanor's attention to detail was evident in everything she did, from the careful way she arranged photographs to the precise measurements she used in cooking. "These are beautiful pictures, Mrs. Whitmore. Your family seems to have had wonderful times together." Eleanor selected a photograph that showed her and Henry dancing at what appeared to be an elegant party. They were both young, dressed in formal wear that spoke of prosperity and social standing. Behind them, other couples danced in a ballroom that rivaled anything in luxury hotels. That was taken at the Petroleum Club in Dallas, 1967. Henry had just closed a deal for drilling rights on 50,000 acres in East Texas. "We thought we were on top of the world." She showed him more pictures from their prosperous years. The couple standing beside expensive cars, vacationing in exotic locations, entertaining friends at parties that looked like scenes from movies about wealthy oil families. Eleanor had been beautiful in her youth, confident and radiant in the way that comes from security and success. "It's funny how money changes everything and nothing at the same time," Eleanor mused, studying a picture of herself standing beside an oil derrick. "We had more money than we knew what to do with, but we were still the same people underneath. When the money was gone, we were still us." Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor's story, not just because of the mystery surrounding her finances, but because of the grace with which she seemed to have handled the loss of wealth. Most people who had fallen from prosperity to poverty carried bitterness or resentment. Eleanor seemed to have found peace with her circumstances. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you ever regret the way things turned out? If you could go back and make different choices?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap as she considered the question. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through both triumph and loss. "Mr. Rivera, regret is a luxury I can't afford at my age. Henry and I made the best decisions we could with the information we had at the time. Some of those decisions worked out, others didn't, but I wouldn't trade the life we built together for all the oil money in Texas." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus continued his exploration of the mansion's hidden spaces. In a closet beneath the main staircase, he discovered boxes of business records that Eleanor apparently hadn't touched in years. The papers told the story of Whitmore Energy's rise and fall in greater detail than Eleanor had shared. The company had indeed been successful, developing productive wells throughout Texas and Louisiana. But the records also showed a pattern of risky investments, partnerships with questionable operators, and financial decisions that prioritized expansion over stability. Henry Whitmore had been a wildcatter, in the truest sense, gambling everything on the next big discovery. Among the business papers, Marcus found something that stopped him cold. A legal document dated just 3 months earlier, bearing Eleanor's signature and the seal of a Houston law firm. The document was thick with legal language, but the basic meaning was clear. Eleanor had recently completed some kind of significant financial transaction involving mineral rights and oil properties. Marcus studied the document carefully, trying to understand its implications. The legal language was complex, but it appeared that Eleanor had sold or transferred ownership of something valuable, something related to her family's oil business. The transaction had been completed just months before Marcus began working at the mansion. The timing was suspicious. Eleanor had hired Marcus to restore a house she claimed she couldn't afford to maintain, but she had apparently completed a significant financial transaction just before beginning the expensive restoration project. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to suggest a picture very different from the story Eleanor had told. That evening, Marcus drove home with more questions than answers. Eleanor Whitmore was either the most gracious poor person he'd ever met, or she was hiding a secret that might explain her contradictory behavior. The safe in the basement, the recent legal document, the expensive repairs she could somehow afford despite claiming poverty, nothing added up. Diego and Sofia were waiting for him with homework questions and stories about their day at school. Marcus helped with math problems and listened to Sofia's detailed account of a class field trip to the Natural History Museum. But his mind kept returning to the mystery of Eleanor Whitmore and the secrets hidden in her crumbling mansion. "Dad, you're thinking about the ghost house again," Sofia observed with the perceptiveness that sometimes surprised him. "Did you find more old pictures today?" "Something like that, Mija. Mrs. Whitmore has lived an interesting life." Diego looked up from his social studies textbook, his expression serious. "Dad, is Mrs. Whitmore poor?" "Because you said her house is falling apart, but only rich people live in houses that big." It was a question that cut to the heart of Marcus's confusion. The mansion was located in the wealthiest neighborhood in the city, surrounded by houses worth millions of dollars. Even in its current condition, the Whitmore estate represented enormous value. Yet Eleanor lived like someone who couldn't afford basic repairs. "That's complicated, Diego. Sometimes people have valuable things but not much money to spend. Like if you owned a really expensive painting but couldn't sell it because it had sentimental value." Sofia wrinkled her nose in the way she did when processing complex ideas. But why wouldn't she sell the big house and buy a little house and have money left over? It was exactly the question Marcus had been asking himself. Eleanor claimed the mansion held too many memories to sell, but people facing genuine poverty usually found ways to monetize their assets. Unless there were reasons she couldn't sell, or unless she wasn't as poor as she appeared. That night, Marcus found himself researching mineral rights and oil royalties on his laptop. What he learned was fascinating and potentially relevant to Eleanor's situation. When oil companies bought land or drilling rights, they often structured deals that included ongoing royalty payments to the original owners. These payments could continue for decades, providing steady income long after the initial sale. If Henry and Eleanor had structured their business deals to include royalty agreements, Eleanor might still be receiving payments from wells that continued producing oil. The income might not be enormous, but it could explain how she managed to pay for home repairs while living modestly in other areas. But if Eleanor was receiving oil royalties, why was she living in a deteriorating mansion and worrying about heating bills? Why not use the income to properly restore the house or move somewhere more manageable? Unless the royalty payments were irregular, or unless she was saving the money for some specific purpose. Marcus fell asleep with his laptop still open, dreaming of oil wells and hidden safes and old women with secrets that grew more complex with each revelation. Tomorrow he would return to the mansion and continue the careful work of restoration. But now he would also be looking for clues to solve the mystery of Eleanor Whitmore's true financial situation. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Marcus was loading his truck when his cell phone rang, the caller ID showing a Houston area code he didn't recognize. "Mr. Rivera, this is Jonathan Blackwood from Blackwood Stern and Associates in Houston. I represent the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, and I need to discuss a matter of some urgency with you." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Is Mrs. Whitmore all right?" "Mrs. Whitmore is fine, Mr. Rivera, but I understand you've been working on her property, and there are some legal matters we need to discuss. Would it be possible for you to meet with me today?" The lawyer's tone was professional but urgent, suggesting that whatever he wanted to discuss couldn't wait. Marcus agreed to meet at a coffee shop near the courthouse, his mind racing with possibilities. Why would Eleanor's lawyer need to speak with him? Had he accidentally discovered something he wasn't supposed to see? Jonathan Blackwood turned out to be a man in his 50s, expensively dressed and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling significant financial matters. He ordered coffee and studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone who was used to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "Mr. Rivera, I'm going to be direct with you because time is a factor in this situation. Mrs. Whitmore has recently come into possession of assets that make her one of the wealthiest women in the state of Texas. She's asked me to handle the legal and financial implications of her new situation, and that includes ensuring the people working for her are properly vetted and trustworthy." Marcus stared at the lawyer, trying to process what he was hearing. Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who worried about heating bills and shopped for generic groceries, was one of the wealthiest women in Texas? "I don't understand, Mr. Blackwood." "Mrs. Whitmore lives very modestly. She pays me in cash and seems to be careful with every penny." Blackwood smiled, the expression suggesting he was familiar with Eleanor's tendency toward financial discretion. "Mr. Rivera, Eleanor Whitmore has recently inherited mineral rights and oil properties worth approximately $500 million. The inheritance came from a distant relative who died without heirs, and Mrs. Whitmore was the next of kin, according to genealogical research conducted by the estate." The lawyer opened a briefcase and withdrew documents that supported his incredible claim. Legal papers from probate court, geological surveys showing proven oil reserves, financial statements from banks that managed royalty payments. Eleanor Whitmore had indeed inherited a fortune that would place her among the wealthiest individuals in the country. "The inheritance became final 3 months ago," Blackwood continued. "Mrs. Whitmore has asked me to conduct background checks on everyone who has access to her property. She's particularly concerned about people who might try to take advantage of her situation." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. The safe in the basement, the recent legal documents, Eleanor's ability to pay for expensive repairs while claiming poverty. She hadn't been poor at all. She'd been protecting herself while adjusting to sudden, enormous wealth. "Mr. Blackwood, why are you telling me this? If Mrs. Whitmore wanted me to know about her inheritance, wouldn't she tell me herself?" The lawyer's expression grew serious. "Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Whitmore is 84 years old and suddenly worth $500 million. She's received over 200 letters from supposed relatives, investment advisors, and charitable organizations since word of her inheritance began circulating. She's hired security consultants, financial advisors, and legal teams to protect her interests, but she's also insisted on continuing to live in her family home and maintaining her regular routines." Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Mrs. Whitmore specifically requested that I speak with you because she values your work and wants to ensure you're properly compensated for your discretion. She's prepared to offer you a substantial bonus for your continued services and your commitment to keeping her personal business private." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he was learning. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't a poor widow struggling to maintain her family home. She was a billionaire who was choosing to live modestly while figuring out how to handle her new wealth responsibly. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate Mrs. Whitmore's confidence, but I'm just a handyman. I fix broken pipes and electrical problems. I don't know anything about managing wealth or keeping financial secrets." The lawyer smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "Mr. Rivera, according to Mrs. Whitmore, you're exactly the kind of person she needs working on her property. Someone who treats her with respect, does quality work, and doesn't ask too many personal questions. She's prepared to pay you $50,000 as a discretion bonus, plus triple your current daily rate for continued work on the mansion." The numbers hit Marcus like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than he'd earned in the previous 2 years combined. Triple his daily rate would solve every financial problem his family faced and provide security he'd never imagined possible. But accepting the money would also mean becoming part of Eleanor's secret, helping her maintain the fiction of modest circumstances while she was actually worth more than most small countries' GDP. Marcus had to decide whether he was comfortable with that level of deception, even if it was designed to protect a vulnerable elderly woman. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to think about this. It's a lot to process." "Of course, but Mr. Rivera, I should mention that Mrs. Whitmore has plans for the mansion that go far beyond basic repairs. She wants to restore it to its original condition, spare no expense, turn it into a showplace worthy of the Whitmore family legacy. The project could take years and would provide steady, well-paid employment for someone she trusts." As Marcus drove back to the mansion, his mind reeled with the implications of what he'd learned. Eleanor Whitmore had been testing him, evaluating his character and trustworthiness while he thought he was simply fixing her broken house. The woman who served him coffee in chipped mugs was worth $500 million. The revelation changed everything and nothing. Eleanor was still the kind woman who cooked incredible meals and shared stories about her life. The mansion still needed extensive repairs and restoration. Marcus still needed steady work to support his children, but now there were questions about honesty, discretion, and the moral implications of helping someone hide their true wealth. When Marcus arrived at the mansion, Eleanor was waiting for him on the front porch, her expression suggesting she knew exactly where he'd been and what he'd learned. For the first time since he'd started working for her, she looked like someone who could afford to own a $3 million house in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. "Mr. Rivera," she said as he approached, "I believe you've had an interesting morning. Perhaps we should have a conversation about what comes next." Eleanor Whitmore stood on her front porch with the bearing of someone who had just shed a carefully maintained disguise. Gone was the frail uncertainty that had characterized her movements for the past 2 weeks. In its place stood a woman who radiated the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can afford to solve any problem money can fix. "Shall we go inside, Mr. Rivera? I believe we have quite a bit to discuss." Marcus followed Eleanor through the mansion's grand entrance, but this time he saw the space differently. The peeling wallpaper wasn't evidence of poverty, but of someone choosing to live with imperfection. The covered furniture in unused rooms wasn't about saving heating costs, but about a woman who preferred the intimacy of a few well-used spaces over the vastness of a fully occupied mansion. Eleanor led him to the kitchen, where she began preparing coffee with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything else. But now Marcus noticed the quality of the coffee beans, the expensive grinder she used, the precision of her movements that spoke of someone accustomed to the finer things in life. "Mr. Rivera, I owe you an apology," Eleanor said as she measured coffee with scientific precision. "I've been less than honest about my circumstances, and that wasn't fair to you. But I hope you can understand why an 84-year-old woman might be cautious about revealing sudden wealth to people she's just met." Marcus sat at the kitchen table that he now realized was probably a genuine antique worth more than his annual income. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Blackwood told me about your inheritance. $500 million is hard to comprehend." Eleanor smiled, settling into the chair across from him with the grace of someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Rivera, 3 months ago I was exactly who you thought I was. A widow living on Social Security and a small pension, trying to maintain a house too big and too expensive for my budget. Then a lawyer from Houston called to tell me that my late husband's great-uncle had died and left me oil properties I didn't know existed. She poured coffee into the same chipped mugs they'd been using since Marcus started working at the mansion. The gesture spoke volumes about Eleanor's character. Enormous wealth hadn't changed her fundamental nature or her appreciation for simple pleasures. "The inheritance came with complications," Eleanor continued. "Distant relatives who suddenly remembered my existence, investment advisors calling at all hours, reporters wanting to write stories about the poor widow who struck it rich. I learned quickly that being wealthy makes you a target for people who see opportunity instead of a human being." Marcus understood why Eleanor had been cautious. Sudden wealth, especially for someone living alone, would attract attention from every direction. Con artists, gold diggers, unscrupulous relatives, and legitimate business people who might not have her best interests at heart. Mrs. Whitmore, why did you decide to trust me with this information? Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful as she considered her answer. Mr. Rivera, I've been watching you work for 2 weeks. I've seen how you treat my house, how you talk about your children, how you handle problems with patience and creativity. You could have overcharged me for repairs, cut corners to increase your profit, or pressured me to authorize expensive work I didn't need. Instead, you've been honest, careful, and respectful. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the table's wooden surface. More importantly, you've treated me like a person, not a customer or a source of income. That's become rare in my life since the inheritance became public knowledge. Marcus felt the weight of Eleanor's trust settling on his shoulders. She had been testing him, evaluating his character while he thought he was simply fixing her broken house. The realization was both flattering and intimidating. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Blackwood mentioned plans for restoring the mansion. If you're comfortable sharing, what did you have in mind? Eleanor's eyes lit up with enthusiasm that transformed her from elderly woman to excited homeowner. She disappeared into another room and returned with architectural drawings, historical photographs, and what appeared to be a comprehensive restoration plan. Mr. Rivera, this house was built to be magnificent. My husband's grandfather spared no expense when he commissioned it in 1895. Every detail was crafted by master artisans, every material chosen for beauty and durability. I want to restore it to that original vision. The plans spread across the kitchen table were breathtaking. Complete restoration of the mansion's electrical and plumbing systems. Refinishing of all the hardwood floors. Professional restoration of the original wallpaper and paint. Repair and cleaning of every chandelier. Renovation of all bathrooms and the kitchen. Restoration of the carriage house to serve as a guest residence. The project would take approximately 18 months to complete properly, Eleanor explained, pointing to timeline estimates penciled in the margins. I've consulted with historical preservation specialists, and they estimate the cost at around $3 million. Marcus studied the plans, trying to comprehend the scope of work involved. This wasn't simple home repair anymore. This was a complete restoration that would require teams of specialists, custom manufactured materials, and coordination that resembled managing a construction company. Mrs. Whitmore, this is an enormous undertaking. You'd need general contractors, historical preservation experts, craftsmen who specialize in Victorian-era techniques. I'm just one person with basic construction skills. Eleanor's smile suggested she had anticipated this concern. Mr. Rivera, I don't want to hire a large construction company that would treat this house like any other renovation project. I want someone who understands that every room has history, every detail has meaning. I want someone who will oversee the work with the same care and respect you've shown in the past 2 weeks. She opened another folder containing financial projections and compensation proposals. I'm prepared to offer you the position of restoration manager for the entire project. You would coordinate all the specialized work, oversee quality control, and ensure that every aspect of the restoration honors the mansion's original character. The salary would be $200,000 per year, plus bonuses for completing phases ahead of schedule. Quote, the numbers struck Marcus like lightning. $200,000 per year was more money than he had ever imagined earning. It would transform his children's lives, provide security his family had never known, open opportunities that seemed impossible just hours earlier. But accepting Eleanor's offer would also mean becoming fully invested in her world of hidden wealth and careful deception. Marcus would be managing a $3 million restoration project while maintaining the fiction that Eleanor was a modest widow struggling with home repairs. Mrs. Whitmore, what about the people who will be working on the restoration? Contractors, craftsmen, suppliers. How do we explain a $3 million renovation project if you're supposed to be living on a limited income? Eleanor had clearly anticipated this question as well. Mr. Rivera, the restoration will be funded through a historical preservation trust that I'm establishing. As far as contractors know, the work is being paid for by a foundation dedicated to maintaining architecturally significant properties. Your role would be representing the trust's interests and ensuring the work meets their exacting standards. Quote, the cover story was elegant in its simplicity. Historical preservation trusts often funded expensive restoration projects for properties with architectural or cultural significance. The Whitmore mansion certainly qualified, and Eleanor's wealth would allow her to fund the trust generously without revealing her personal involvement. Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask why this restoration is so important to you? With $500 million, you could buy any house in the world, live anywhere you wanted. Why invest so much in preserving this particular place? Eleanor's expression grew distant, as if she were seeing through the mansion's current decay to its original grandeur. Mr. Rivera, this house represents everything my husband's family achieved in America. They came here with nothing and built something magnificent. When Henry and I lost our money, I felt like I'd failed to preserve that legacy. She stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the overgrown garden, where geometric patterns still hinted at formal landscaping. Now I have the resources to restore not just the house, but the grounds, the carriage house, everything the Whitmore family created. I can ensure that future generations will see what's possible when people work hard and dream big. Marcus understood the emotional significance of Eleanor's project. This wasn't about creating a showplace or displaying wealth. This was about honoring family history and preserving a legacy that had nearly been lost to financial hardship and the passage of time. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm honored that you would consider me for this position, but I need to be honest about my qualifications. I've never managed a project this large or complex. I don't have experience with historical preservation or coordinating teams of specialists. Eleanor returned to the table, her expression confident and reassuring. Mr. Rivera, I've spent the past 3 months interviewing project managers, construction supervisors, and restoration specialists. They all had impressive credentials and extensive experience. They also treated me like a checkbook with no brain attached. She opened her laptop, showing Marcus profiles of the professionals she had considered. These people see dollar signs instead of history. They want to modernize everything, take shortcuts to reduce costs. Treat the mansion like any other construction project. You see this house the way I do, as something precious that deserves to be preserved with care and respect. The afternoon was spent reviewing detailed restoration plans, studying historical photographs of the mansion in its prime, and discussing the timeline for various phases of work. Eleanor had researched every aspect of the project with the same meticulous attention she brought to cooking and household management. The electrical system would be completely rewired using period-appropriate fixtures and switches. The plumbing would be updated to modern standards while maintaining the original bathroom layouts and vintage aesthetic. Every window would be restored rather than replaced, preserving the original glass and hardware wherever possible. Mrs. Whitmore, this level of detail and authenticity will require specialists who understand Victorian-era construction techniques. That's going to be expensive and time-consuming. Eleanor's response demonstrated why she had been successful in the oil business decades earlier. Mr. Rivera, cutting corners to save money or time would defeat the purpose of the restoration. This house deserves to be rebuilt properly, the same way it was constructed originally. Money isn't the limiting factor anymore. As they discussed the project's scope, Marcus began to understand why Eleanor had chosen him for the position. She needed someone who would prioritize quality over speed, authenticity over convenience, respect for history over modern efficiency. The restoration wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about honoring the craftsmanship and vision of the people who had originally built the mansion. The financial implications of Eleanor's offer continued to overwhelm Marcus as the day progressed. $200,000 per year would solve every problem his family faced and provide opportunities he'd never dared to imagine. Diego could attend private school, develop his academic talents without worrying about limited resources. Sofia could take dance lessons, participate in activities that required money his current income couldn't support, but accepting Eleanor's offer would also mean keeping secrets that grew more complex each day. Marcus would be managing a multi-million-dollar project while pretending it was funded by a historical preservation trust. He would be earning more money than most executives while maintaining the facade of being a simple handyman. That evening's conversation with Diego and Sofia took on new significance, as Marcus considered how Eleanor's offer might change their lives. The children were finishing homework at the kitchen table, their books and papers spread across the surface where Marcus had eaten countless meals while worrying about bills and budgets. "Dad, you look different today," Sofia observed with the perceptiveness that sometimes caught him off guard, "like you're thinking about something really important." Marcus sat beside his daughter, studying her earnest expression and remembering all the times he'd wished he could provide more for her. Dance lessons she wanted but they couldn't afford. school trips that required fees beyond their budget, simple luxuries that other children took for granted but remained out of reach for his family. Mija, what would you think if we could afford to move to a bigger apartment? Maybe one with a yard where you could play outside? Sofia's eyes widened with excitement, but Diego's expression grew cautious. The boy had inherited his father's tendency to worry about financial security, and he understood that sudden improvements usually came with hidden costs. "Dad, did something good happen at work today? Did Mrs. Whitmore give you a raise?" Marcus chose his words carefully, trying to be honest without revealing Eleanor's secrets. "Mrs. Whitmore has offered me a bigger job, one that would pay much better than what I'm earning now, but it would also mean more responsibility and longer hours." Diego nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious beyond his 12 years. "Dad, would the new job be safe? I mean, would it last long enough for us to count on the money?" The question cut to the heart of Marcus's concerns about Eleanor's offer. Managing the mansion's restoration would provide excellent income for 18 months, but what would happen when the project was complete? Would Eleanor need his services afterward? Or would he find himself looking for work again with a gap in employment that would be difficult to explain? Sofia had no such concerns about long-term planning. "Dad, if we had more money, could I take ballet lessons like Emma in my class? She says they have costumes and everything." The simple request reminded Marcus of all the ways his children had learned to live with less, while their friends enjoyed advantages that money could provide. Sofia had never complained about the limitations, but Marcus knew she noticed the differences between their family's circumstances and those of her classmates. "We'll see, Mija. The new job would make a lot of things possible that we can't afford right now." That night, after Diego and Sofia were asleep, Marcus sat at his laptop researching historical restoration projects and the specialized contractors who managed them. What he learned was both encouraging and intimidating. Restoration managers were highly paid professionals who coordinated complex projects requiring expertise in architecture, construction, and historical preservation. The work Eleanor was offering would position Marcus as a project manager for one of the most significant private restoration projects in the region. Success would establish his reputation and open opportunities for similar work on other historical properties. But failure could damage his credibility and make it difficult to find work in related fields. Marcus also researched the legal and ethical implications of maintaining Eleanor's cover story about the Historical Preservation Trust. As long as the trust was legally established and properly funded, representing its interests wouldn't involve any deception. Eleanor's personal wealth would remain private, and the restoration would be legitimate preservation work funded by a legal entity. The morning brought a phone call that added urgency to Marcus's decision. Jonathan Blackwood was calling to discuss timeline and legal arrangements for the restoration project. "Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Whitmore is eager to begin the restoration as soon as possible. Winter weather limits some types of work, but we can start with interior projects that don't depend on outdoor conditions. Mrs. Whitmore would like your decision by tomorrow so we can begin assembling the team." The lawyer's tone suggested that Eleanor's offer wouldn't remain open indefinitely. She was prepared to move forward with the restoration, whether Marcus accepted the management position or not. If he declined, she would find someone else to oversee the project, and Marcus would return to small repair jobs that barely paid the bills. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm honored by Mrs. Whitmore's confidence, but I need to understand the long-term implications. What happens when the restoration is complete? Would there be ongoing work maintaining the property?" Blackwood's response suggested that Eleanor had considered this question as well. "Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Whitmore is establishing a comprehensive property management operation for the estate. The restoration is just the first phase of her plans. She intends to maintain the mansion as a private residence while also using it for charitable functions and historical education. There would be permanent positions for people she trusts to manage various aspects of the operation." The conversation revealed that Eleanor's plans extended far beyond simple restoration. She was creating an operation that would preserve the mansion's historical significance while using her wealth to benefit the community. The project would provide stable employment for years, not just the 18 months required for restoration. Marcus spent the afternoon at the mansion working on electrical repairs while Eleanor finalized details for the restoration project. She had meetings with lawyers, architects, and preservation specialists. coordinating the complex logistics required to begin work on such an ambitious undertaking. During lunch, Eleanor shared more details about her vision for the completed project. "Mr. Rivera, I want this house to serve as an example of what's possible when people have the resources to preserve history properly. Too many significant buildings are demolished because restoration seems too expensive or complicated. I want to prove that careful preservation can bring these places back to life." Eleanor showed Marcus photographs of similar restoration projects that had transformed deteriorating mansions into showcases of architectural preservation. The before and after images were dramatic, demonstrating how expert restoration could recover beauty that seemed lost forever. "Mrs. Whitmore, these restorations are incredible, but they must have taken teams of specialists working for years." Eleanor's smile suggested she was prepared for the challenge. "Mr. Rivera, I have the resources to hire the best people in the country, and I have the time to ensure the work is done properly. What I need is someone who will ensure that every decision honors the house's history and maintains the highest standards of craftsmanship." As the day progressed, Marcus found himself increasingly convinced that Eleanor's offer represented the opportunity of a lifetime. The chance to manage a significant historical restoration project, work with master craftsmen, and learn skills that would establish his reputation in a specialized field that valued quality over speed. The financial security Eleanor's offer provided would transform his children's lives in ways that extended far beyond better housing and more opportunities. Diego's academic talents could be developed through private tutoring and advanced courses. Sofia's creative interests could be nurtured through lessons and activities that would help her discover her passions and abilities. But accepting Eleanor's offer also meant embracing the complexity of her situation. Marcus would be managing a project funded by enormous wealth, while maintaining discretion about the source of that funding. He would be working for someone whose true financial situation had to remain secret for her own protection. When Eleanor asked for his decision that afternoon, Marcus realized he had already made his choice. The opportunity to preserve something beautiful and historically significant while providing security for his family was too valuable to decline. "Mrs. Whitmore, I accept your offer. I'll do everything I can to ensure this restoration honors your family's legacy and preserves this house for future generations." Eleanor's smile transformed her from wealthy widow to excited homeowner embarking on the project of her dreams. "Mr. Rivera, I believe this house has been waiting for exactly the right person to bring it back to life. I'm confident we've found that person." The handshake that sealed their agreement felt like more than an employment contract. It was a partnership between two people who understood that some things are worth preserving regardless of cost, that quality matters more than speed, and that the right person in the right place at the right time can accomplish extraordinary things. As Marcus prepared to leave the mansion that evening, Eleanor handed him a thick folder containing architectural drawings, contractor contacts, and project timelines. "Mr. Rivera, tomorrow we begin transforming this house into everything it was meant to be. I hope you're ready for an adventure." Driving home through the increasingly modest neighborhoods that led to his apartment, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity settling on his shoulders. In accepting Eleanor's offer, he had agreed to manage the most significant project of his career while maintaining secrets that protected a vulnerable woman's privacy and security. The restoration of the Whitmore mansion would test his skills, challenge his abilities, and provide opportunities he had never imagined possible. But it would also give him the chance to preserve something beautiful and historically significant while building a secure future for his children. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.